Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're on session 7 of our FastAPI series. So far, we've covered the basics, and now we're building something real and exciting. A simple Instagram clone API that users can post updates and follow each other's and see every feed. All stored in a database with SQL Alchemy. It's a practical intermediate project, so without wasting time, let's dive in and clone some Instagram vibes. So first of all, we have to start with the essentials. So we have to download and install all of the libraries or the package, the Python package or libraries that we need. So for that, I'm going to open up my terminal here, and first of all, I have to activate my virtual environment. So I'm just going inside my PowerShell in Windows. I'm going to enable my virtual environment, calling its name. I'm going to the scripts directory and just activate it. Okay, so it's activated, and right now I can install all of the libraries, the Python libraries that I need. I think we have installed all of the essentials except the SQL Alchemy. So let's go and install it. We can install it using the pip install SQL Alchemy command, and it just takes a while to be installed. Okay, once it's installed, I think we have all the package or Python libraries that we need. Okay, so let's go and import the FastAPI and SQL Alchemy and setting up our app and SQLite database. So here is what we have to do. So first of all, we're going to import the FastAPI class. We're going to import the FastAPI class from the FastAPI library that we have installed in section 1 on our virtual environment. So I'm just going to import it, and here I have to import the SQL Alchemy. So I'm going to import from SQL Alchemy some methods like create engine and a column and some integers and string, because we want to work with those data types. We want to create some columns inside our table in our database that we're going to create, and after that we have to work with some integers for example for some fields like IDs or the user number, user age, or something like that, and we have to work with strings. And it's obvious why we have to work with strings when we want to create a database. The most obvious thing is that we actually need to create a username, and all of the usernames contain some strings, or all of them are strings. Okay, so plus we have to add some another methods from SQL Alchemy, and I'm going to import from SQL Alchemy that ext.declarative. I'm going to import the declarative base. I'm going to explain it next. And also we have to import from the sqlalchemy.orm. We're going to import the session maker. Okay, it's enough. So that was all the methods and classes that we want to work with to create an Instagram clone. Okay, so let's just go and define our app variable, which is an instance from our FastAPI class. And actually here we have to set up or define our database. So here I'm going to define our database, and to define our database we need to declare a variable called engine, and for that I'm going to use create engine method and give it a path. For example, I'm going to tell it that I want to create a SQLite database, so I'm going to write SQLite and give it a name just like that, and I'm going to call it instaclone.db. So that is the URL or the path for our database or our engine that I just told the create engine method to create for me a SQLite database with instaclone name, and the value of this create engine method is gonna be stored inside this variable. So this is gonna be our engine to create the database for us. Okay, and now we have to define another variable, and let's declare it the base variable, which is equal to declarative base function. And then we're going to declare our last variable and call it session local and give it a value of the session maker function. And let's just add a bind, and it's gonna bind the engine for us. Okay, so it's going to just going to call the engine variable and create our database for us. So that was all to define our database and just create it. Okay, so that was all, and there we go. Our foundations set. We've got FastAPI. We've got the FastAPI here for the API, and SQL Alchemy with create engine for our creating engine for our instaclone database, SQLite database, plus the base and session local for models and sessions that we have to work with. And this is our app's backbone. Okay, so let's define the data next. We need the data to store inside our database. So let's just go and define the data that we need. And for that, we have to create some models. Okay, so we need actually inside our database, when we create this database, we need tables inside that database. Okay, we need two tables, one for users. So okay, so let's just add a comment. We need two tables, one for users and another one for actually the posts. Okay, the posts. And our users should have a name and ID, and our posts should have text and a user ID. Okay, so here's how we can set them up. Let's see how we can do that. So first of all, let's define our models, our classes for our models for creating a table inside our database. For that, we have to define a class. So I'm going to define a class called user, and it's gonna instantiate the base, and because it's gonna be a base model. And here we have to define a name for our table. So we're going to create a table called user inside our instaclone database. So we have to define a user, we have to define a table name for our table that we want to create inside our database. Okay, how we can define the table name, just like that, double underscores, and table name double underscore. And now inside these double quotations, we can just write the name of our table that we want to store it inside our instaclone database, just right there. Okay, so the name of our table is going to be users. And what fields do we have to create this table? Obviously we need an ID for each user, so I'm going to define a field or a parameter ID, and I'm going to create a column inside my table, inside my database, and this column should be a type of integer, and it should be a primary key. So I'm going to set the value of this property inside the column function, the primary key. I'm gonna give it a value of true because it should be a primary key. All the IDs for each user should be a primary key, and with data types of integers, and we set the index to true also. Okay, so the next field that we need to create a user model is the username. Each user should have a username. Okay, so we're going to define it. Define a username. It should be also a column inside our table, and the type of this column is going to be string, and it should be unique. Each user should have a unique username, and the index is obviously true. So, and this is some description about what index do. Okay, So that was all about the user class or user model. Then we need to define another class called post. It should instantiate the base also. And here we have to define a name for our post table. So double underscore table name double underscore and give a value of type string called posts. Okay, so like before, each post should have an ID, okay, and it should be a primary key. So let's define it. We're going to define an ID, create a column for it inside our table. In our database, the data type of our ID should be integer, and the primary key should set to true, and index also be true. And each post should have a user ID to make a relationship between the post and the user that posts that post. Okay, so we're going to create a field called user ID and give it a value and create a column for it, and this column just should be an integer. Okay, we don't want to get too much deep inside this foundation of Instagram, because it is an intermediate project, and for that I'm not going too much deep. And let's declare the last field or the last column that we want to have inside our table, our post table. So I'm going to define the text field and create another column. So the posts table gonna have 3 columns: ID, user ID, and text. Okay, so I'm going to create that column, give it a type of string. Okay, and yes, that's it. So after all of this, we're going to call the base and call a function called meta data dot create all and give it a bind equal to engine. Okay, it's pretty nice. Our user model, this class is our user model, and our user model has an ID, just like you see here, a unique ID, a primary key ID, a unique username, and post has an ID, user ID to link to a specific user, and text for the updates. And we just have called the create all function builds, and the create all function actually gonna build these tables in our database. So we've got the structure. Okay, so actually it's now to post something. Okay, but for posting something, we need some endpoints. We need some endpoints to give them to the front end, or directly give them to our users, and just work with our structure that we have created so far. Okay, so for that, let's let the people sign up. So we'll make a post endpoint to add a new user to the database, and it's going to be simple but essential. So how we can do that? So first of all, let's define a post endpoint and give it a path. I'm going to give the path of users, and here we're going to define our function. So let's define a function called create user, and inside this function we have just to receive the username. So I'm going to receive the username with type of string, and here actually I'm going to define some fields that I want to work with them inside this function, and I'm going to define the database. So I'm going to use the session local function for my database, and here I'm going to define another variable called user and give it a value of user model, here our user model, and a user should be an instance of our user, and we're going to create that user and give it a username as a parameter, and give the value of that username from the URL that we're going to receive that value from our users that those interact with our server. Okay, so I'm going to give that value user name actually, right? And now I'm going to call the database and just add that user that we're going to create from our model and add that user to the database. And after that, we have to commit the changes. And if we want to see those changes, we have to refresh our database based on the user that we have created. And finally, we have to close the connection that we have opened to the database. So pretty cool. And for some to see the results, we have to return something. So I'm going to return a dictionary that I call, for example, message, and just let's use some f strings here, and f user, for example, username has been created. Pretty good. And let's demonstrate the user ID. So for that, I'm going to say user ID is equal to user.id. So that's all. It's sweet. This post endpoint at this path that we have declared here takes a username, creates a user object. So here takes the username and make a connection to our database. And when the connection has been established, it's gonna create a user for us based on the username that it gonna receive from our users, those interact with our server. And when it creates that object, it's gonna save it into the database and add it to the database, commit the changes, save them to the database, and refresh our database and close the connection. And after all of these processes, finally it gonna returns the object that saved into our database by its ID and username at the localhost. Okay, so we've got your first user. Now let's add some posting functionalities to our API and create our post endpoint. So I think right now it's time to let the users share updates, and we'll add a post endpoint to log a text post tied to a user with his ID, tied to a user ID, for example, and our Instagram style content. So here's how we can do that. Actually here we have to create a new endpoint with the post HTTP method and give it a path. So we're going to just give it this path and define the function that we need. So I'm going to find a function called create post, and for creating a post we need some parameters like the user ID, the ID of that user that going to create that post, and a user ID of type int, and a text of type string, and the text is going to be the content of that post. Pretty cool. And now here we have to open a connection to our database. So I'm going to open that connection using the session local function from the SQL Alchemy library that we have added to our virtual environment. And then I have to create a post. So for that, I'm going to use the post model and just give it some properties like user IDs and give the value of user ID from the user ID endpoint, from the posts endpoint, and let's give a value to text from our endpoint. Okay, it's pretty cool. And now when we created the post object, it's time to add it to the database. So how we can do that? We just call the database, the connection of that database that we have opened, and just add that post to our database, and let's commit or save the changes and refresh the information or the data inside our database using the refresh function, and let's refresh our database based on the post object that we have created so far. And after all this process, we have to close our connection. So let's close the connection and return a message. So we're going to return a dictionary that just says this is our message. And what is the message? It's that the post added, and let's return the ID. So post ID is post ID. Awesome. This is the post endpoint at posts. So it takes a user ID and text, saves it as a post, and confirms with the ID, confirms it with the ID of that user, and send the post data like the user ID and the content of that post, where it's actually just a text, to our localhost, and our first post is going to be live. So let's see the feed next. Let's finish with the feed or explorer, or the explorer of our Instagram. And for creating an explorer for our Instagram API, to showing all the posts by all users, we'll make a get endpoint to fetch users' posts from the database, and let's think how we can do it. But the first thing that we know, we have to create a endpoint with the get_HTTP method and define a path for it. So I'm going to say explore, for example, let's add a user ID to see all the posts of a specific user, not all the users of our database. Okay, so I'm going to receive a value like user ID here, and let's define a function to be triggered whenever a user just call this endpoint. So inside the explore/user ID, we have to define a function, and that function name is get explore, and gonna receive just the user ID of type string, of type int, and here we have to find our database, open a connection to our database, session local, and create a variable of name called posts, and it should query inside our database. Okay, so db dot just query this model, the post model, and filter that query. Okay, so we have to filter our query based on the post model that we have created, and just call the user ID of that post and validate if the user ID of that post is equal to user ID that some users just entered inside our URL from the server, and get that from our endpoint. Okay, so if the user ID of that post is equal to the user ID that we want to see his or her posts, actually there we're going to validate them and return all of the results that matches this condition. Okay, it's pretty cool. After that, we have to close our connection, and when we close the connection, we just have to return a message and just say that user ID is user ID, and posts is a list of dictionaries, and we're going to just have the ID. Sorry, we're going to have the ID, and I'm going to say that p dot ID, and the key of text, and here I'm going to say p.text, and add a for loop for all the results that were received from this filter query inside our database, and add a for loop for our dictionary inside our list. And here I'm going to say for p in our posts, and the posts is the result of that query based on the limitation that we have added here. Okay, pretty cool. And so that is what we have to return. So if you see here, we don't have a database, okay? But if I am going to run out my API on the local host, you can see that immediately it's gonna create a database for me with the tables that I have created, the models that we need from them for the Instagram API clone. And so let's see what will happen. But before that, let's recap what we've done here in the Explore user. So this get endpoint at this URL grabs all the posts for a user with him or her user ID and returns them as a list. Okay, so if we're going to our local host and explore this URL, after adding some posts, you'll see, for example, Alex updates. It's a simple Instagram explore or feed, and it's pretty exciting, right? So let's just test it and see the result. For that, I have to just start the server. You record section 7 main --reload. Reload, and okay, so may not found, sorry. Reload the app, not the main. Okay, now as you see here, our server has been started on this URL on our local host, and right there, yeah, this is our database. Our database has been created successfully. It's pretty cool. But how we can see what is inside our database? Okay, so in Visual Studio Code, we cannot see what actually is inside our database, but we can do that using some extensions in the Visual Studio Code. So let's go to the extensions tab and just search for SQL, and like you see here, we have SQLite installed, and if you installed the SQLite extension in your Visual Studio Code, you'll be able to see what actually is inside your database. Okay, so if I click on open the database, there is just going to pop up a item, and this is SQLite Explorer. If I'm going to open it, you can see that inside our database we have two tables, posts table and users table. And if I right click on them and click on show table, I can see that I have a table, but right now there's nothing inside my table. And actually here, if I'm going to just click on the show table, like you see here, there's nothing to demonstrate because right now it's completely empty. Okay, it's pretty cool. And what we have to do now is just to test our API. So for that, let's go to the Swagger UI of our API, and like you see here, we have 3 endpoints. Let's first of all create a user. So I'm going to create a user called Taha. Let's execute 200k. Our user has been created with user ID 1, and this is the result. User Taha created. Awesome, it's pretty cool. Okay, and when we have created a user, let's create another user called Alex, and like you see here, so we have a server error because I just duplicated. Yeah, I think I just duplicated. Okay, doesn't matter. And let's go to the post and create a post. For example, my user ID was 1, so let's add my user ID and add the text. This is my first post at Instagram API clone, and let's execute it. So it's 200k and the post has been added with the post ID of 1. If I'm going to create a new, this is my second post at Instagram API clone. This has the 2 post ID with the same user ID. Okay, pretty cool. And for example, if I add user ID 2 and add Alex account. If I execute it, you can see that a post with ID 3 has been added to the database, but with the user ID 2, which belongs to Alex username. Okay, so we have created 3 posts. 2 of them is for Taha account, and the third one is for Alex account with their specific IDs. And if I go into the Explorer and just hit the first user ID, I can see that, okay, so we have an error that said Explore user ID type error, failed to execute. Okay, let's see what actually is happening here. I just added the... Okay, let's refresh. Try it out again. Execute. Okay, we have that error. Let's see what we have this error. Okay, guys, right there, actually, we just have social local, not the function of social local. So if we call it just like that and refresh our server, and let's get back, refresh and try it out with execute number 1, we still have the same error and it says that failed to parse the URL from this. Okay, let's see what we have done wrong. Oh guys, actually I think it's because of that we don't add it a backslash before the our path of our endpoint. So if I add this and refresh the server, I think it's gonna be okay. So let's refresh, try it out, and add user 1 to see all of the posts of Taha's account. Let's execute, and yeah, user ID 1 had these 2 posts. And if I just go into this user ID 2 profile, which belongs to Alex account, and execute it, I can see that Alex have a post with ID of 3, and this is my second post at Alex account. Pretty cool. It's very good. And if I just shut down the server and start it again, you can see here that we still have our data, and our data stored inside our real database, not a temporary in-memory database. And right now we learned how we can create and clone some very cool projects in game and create an API for them and store those values inside the real SQL or SQLite database. It's pretty cool and awesome, guys. We have done it. And right now if we go to the SQLite Explorer again and see what we have inside our post table, here you can see that we have our table, our post table, I think. No, yeah, right now it's our users table. We have an ID, we have a column ID of type integer, we have another column of type string with name of username, and have 2 objects, Taha and Alex. And if we go to the posts, right there we can see that we have 3 columns. The first 2 is integers, have integer data type, where there are actually ID and user ID. This is the third column with type of string, which is our text or our post inside our API, inside our Instagram clone API. Okay, we've done that, and now there's nothing to add for this section, and I think it's enough because it's some intermediate project just to know how we can work with the databases, how we can clone some social media's API and just learn from them and just grow our ideas inside our mind. And that's the end of this session, everyone. We'll build a simple Instagram clone API, post to create user and posts, and get HTTP method to see a user's feed, all stored with SQL Alchemy. And try it out, sign up, and post something cool, check your feed or explore. And if you enjoyed this, give a like or subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments what's next. So thanks for joining me, and see you soon.